if you go on to the CDC's website, you'll see on the left-hand side there is a pyramid, and there's a bold black line at the base of the pyramid with an arrow going upward from conception here, as you can see, all the way up to death. And so what we're talking about, we start out at the bottom of the pyramid with adverse childhood experiences, which then leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. That then leads to the adoption of health risk behaviors. Then you have disease, disability, and social problems, and the top of the pyramid ends with early death. You'll see on the right-hand side there are a couple of arrows that indicate, and I'm trying to point them out now, scientific gaps, and we have a much better understanding of why this happens. So people who experience these traumatic events in childhood end up having changes in their brain and changes in their body due to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We even know, in fact, that this affects the chromosomes at the level of the telomeres, which are the caps at the ends of the chromosomes. And when those caps get shorter, as they do with toxic stress, that presages cell senescence and death. So that at even a subcellular level, these adverse childhood experiences are having profound effects in the brains, the bodies, and even at the subcellular level, which of course then leads to social, emotional, cognitive impairment and adoption of health risk behaviors. And this is an interesting point because many of these health risk behaviors that we identify as problems are actually attempts at solutions for these social, emotional, cognitive impairments. So that's a really unique way to think about this as it's happening. People are trying to deal with the stress from childhood in ways that include smoking. Is there a benefit to smoking a cigarette? Well, we know that nicotine is a psychoactive drug and that there is probably a benefit from taking a puff from a cigarette. It has long-term deleterious consequences, but in the moment that you're doing it, it actually provides some sense of relief. And so it also then helps us understand that when we ask somebody to quit a behavior, such as smoking or drinking or the use of drugs or whatever the drug of choice might happen to be, that it's difficult to do that unless we replace that with something else. So it makes it understandable then why it becomes so difficult. Of course, there are changes in the brain, but we also have to consider that we are asking somebody to give up a coping mechanism when we ask them to stop some of these health risk behaviors. We know that, for example, smoking and drinking leads to problems with lung disease, heart disease, liver disease, and there you see the next step up in the pyramid, and some of these end up with early death from all those diseases or cancer. Now on the right side you see a similar pyramid, and I won't go through the common parts of it where we start at this base of conception, which I'm trying to draw a line to right now. But beneath of the base, preconception, you have trauma and social location, which leads to more problems. So we have generational embodiment over historical trauma. And if we want to think of for just a moment about the historical trauma that's happened to different groups who are living in the United States today, you may consider African Americans who were brought over as slaves and have that historical trauma. You may want to consider about Native Americans who were displaced from their land, or even people who came later to the United States, Holocaust survivors who are experiencing historical trauma. Above that are the social conditions and local contexts that you might find in inner city neighborhoods, or for example, in the case of Appalachia, the coal fields and some of the smaller towns in the coal fields of Appalachia. And on the right-hand side, you see three things listed: microaggressions, which are things that people who are being discriminated against experience on a daily basis that we may not be aware of if we are in the predominant group, which is white Americans in West Virginia. Implicit bias and epigenetics. So we used to think that there was nature versus nurture. Nature was our gene inheritance, and nurture was the environment around us, the pair of ACEs that I've just spoken about. But now we understand that the line between nature and nurture is not quite so clean. Epigenetics helps explain that. We are all born with sets of genes that can be either turned on or turned off. And if we are exposed to certain stressors, we can turn on or off certain genes, which are then inherited by our children and can be passed on for generations. So that the old biblical saying, the sins of the father are inherited by the sons, this is actually true in that what our genetic changes can be inherited by our children. So it's a very interesting way to look at the ACEs pyramid and the historical trauma embodiment element.